The folklore in Kid Cryptid wouldn't exist if it weren't for the rich history and vibrant cultures these stories come from. While we do our best to provide accurate information, we recognize that we are, at best, amateurs here. This podcast is best considered for entertainment purposes only, and it comes from a place of love and respect for the peoples behind the lore. Now, on with the show. I'm Shawn.
I'm Elias.
And you are listening to Kid Cryptid, the podcast where we proudly pontificate upon persnickety and private personages known as cryptids.
That was a mouthful.
It was. And it's funny that you should put it that way, because this week's cryptid, well, you could say it's known for having its mouth full.
Why?
Any guesses?
No.
So maybe that wasn't totally a fair question. We're about to talk about vampires. And, well, while they're technically not cryptids, but we've already kind of broken that rule anyway when we talked about leprechauns.
They don't like garlic.
And besides, vampires have so much history that they can't really be ignored. So let's start with what you know. Tell me about vampires.
Well, I know a bunch of things about vampires. They burn. They technically turn into dust, and if they have sunlight on them, and they don't like garlic. They sleep in coffins. They drink blood, and they only come out at night.
All right. Anything else?
I think they might also drink tomato juice. You never know. That might be a nice vampire.
Yeah, I don't know quite where you got that, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody's tried to write that into vampire lore at this point.
It's actually, I've learned it because sometimes in cartoons, people ask if they're drinking blood, but no, they say, I'm drinking tomato juice.
Okay.
And tomato juice technically looks like blood because it's red.
You know what? I feel like there was an old cartoon called Count Duckula. And I think he drank tomato juice. I could be wrong.
Well, Hotel Transylvania, he drinks blood. Remember? Count Dracula?
Yes. All right. So let's get back on to two topics. Since you especially mentioned him,
Yep.
It sounds to me like you have a pretty good handle on modern vampires.
Yes.
So I'm especially pleased that you didn't mention anything about them sparkling.
What?
Yeah, we'll not go there. So as usual, we'll get back around to what you were talking about. But first, we need to go further back.
Okay.
Now, do you remember how werewolf stories have been around for almost as long as humans have been around?
Yes.
Vampires are pretty similar. It's impossible to know exactly when and where the first vampire story came into existence, but their origins seem to be as far-ranging and somewhat varied. For example, the earliest incarnation of vampires appear to be considered demons and or spirits rather than the undead. So they were things that were summoned by sorcerers and other people.
Okay. Well, necessarily, vampires. I think so sometimes if you get bitten by a bat, that's the usual way to turn into a vampire.
Okay, that's also something we'll get into.
And then then you can also turn into a bat too, and you don't look like a vampire.
Now, in ancient Egypt, it was believed that they were summoned from another world.
That would be the devil world.
Chinese legends tell of the Changxi, which drains your energy rather than your blood. But then, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there are gods depicted that suck blood of their victims. In some legends, vampires can turn into a bat, while in others, they turn into wolves.
Wait.
Right?
Vampires are supposed to be half bat, half human.
Well,
not half werewolf, half human.
In some ancient legends, they turned into wolves, which I guess might explain why werewolves and vampires don't get along. You figure vampires are kind of moving in on werewolves' territory a bit there.
Or maybe they don't. Maybe they do get along because they the vampires turn into wolves, and werewolves probably like wolves, and Maybe they're friends.
Historically, they don't get along very well.
Really?
And I would much rather them fight it out than have them team up to
fine.
form werewolf vampires.
That'd be like a flying werewolf.
Yeah, we don't need that.
Mm-mm.
So,
And that doesn't like garlic? Well, we have garlic.
So let me ask you a question then. Who is the most well-known vampire in the world?
Count Dracula.
Yeah, Dracula. So let's talk about him for a minute, shall we?
Yep.
Did you know that all signs point to him being based off of a real person?
No, I did not know that.
Around 1450 in Romania, where Transylvania happens to be located, there was a noble named Vlad III, or Vlad Dracula. That's pretty much where the direct comparisons stop, though. But when have people ever let facts get in the way of a good story? See, Vlad lived in a time of great conflict between Christian nations and the Ottoman Empire. Romania butted right up against the Ottoman border, and it was a hotbed of conflict as religious wars raged on. Vlad himself was a staunch defender of Christianity, and he played an important role in protecting his lands from being overrun. And while he may have been quite pious as a ruler, he spared his enemies little mercy. He was known for dispatching wounded and captured soldiers by impaling them on long wooden spears and earning the name Vlad the Impaler.
Ooh.
Yeah, ooh is right. Do you know what impaling is?
Yes.
What?
I'm pretty sure it's like where you either stab somebody with something sharp and you just let them sit there for a long time.
Kinda. You know when we make kebabs, how you have to take the meat and put it on the long skewer?
Oh, yeah.
You kind of do that with a person. So you kind of start at the bottom of them and shove it up through them until it comes out their mouth. It's really gruesome and gross and awful and painful. And he was a big fan of that.
Okay, so that's brutal.
It was very brutal.
Brutality.
Now, stories at the time also say that he enjoyed hearing the screams of his victims so much that he would dine among the impaled and dip his bread in their blood.
Okay, I think we're about to get on almost, I think we're about to get on cannibalism here.
Close, but not quite.
Ugh.
It's also debatable whether or not those stories are true. And it really kind of depends on who's telling the story. In Romania, Vlad Dracula is considered a hero because he defended the country so well and was a good ruler. And he was really fierce against his enemies. To his enemies, though, he was an absolute monster. So it's entirely possible that a lot of those stories come from the enemies more so than actual fact.
Okay.
But regardless of whether it's true or not, the monster that is Dracula is now associated with him.
Okay.
And so with those kinds of details, it's really easy to see how Bram Stoker could have drawn inspiration for that most famous bloodsucker.
Yeah.
Now, identifying a vampire has just as many variations. Sensitivity to sunlight, not having a reflection, those are pretty modern takes.
Yeah.
But an old Hungarian method involves having a 7-year-old boy dressed in white ride a white horse around a graveyard. Wherever the horse stops is where the vampire is hiding. Now, personally, I think I screwed up a bit here. If I had known this about a year ago, I would have totally put you to work as a vampire hunter.
Why me? I don't have any stakes.
No, but you were 7. We could have totally put you in a white suit and found a white horse.
My horse would probably never see the vampire.
Look, we missed a money-making opportunity, and I'm blaming myself. But point is, you could have had a job by now.
I don't want a job yet. I'm too young.
Now, in medieval Europe, they had a lot of different things to mark someone as a potential vampire.
Okay.
Most of them involve checking for signs when you were born. Babies born with teeth, or an extra nipple, or even odd birthmarks were thought to be signs that a person would likely rise from the dead to be a bloodsucker.
That don't have any birthmarks.
Well, okay, good. You would have passed the test in medieval Europe. Now, I didn't read anything that said that they outright killed the babies. It sounded like they lived lives of suspicion and likely had stuff done to their bodies after they died.
Oh!
What kind of things, do you ask? Well, archaeologists have found skeletons with iron rods run through their chests. Others have had bricks shoved into their mouths.
Ooh,
Some have been decapitated.
Okay.
So, do you know what that means?
It basically means your head gets chopped off.
Correct. So all of these methods were seen as ways to keep the dead from rising from the grave.
Okay.
So, like, in the event that a vampire went undetected, though,
Yeah.
there were still ways to protect yourself.
Mm-hmm.
While I'm familiar with garlic being helpful, one method that I was unaware of suggests that carrying a bag of salt is helpful.
And using stakes.
Well, do you know what the salt was for?
No.
So, if you're being chased by a vampire, all you have to do is throw the salt over your shoulder, and the vampire has to stop and count each individual piece of salt. Apparently, vampires are very obsessive counters.
That's why his name is Count Dracula.
Turning back to history, another instance of a suspected vampire comes to us in the form of a Hungarian noblewoman in the late 1500s.
A woman?
Yep, her name was Elizabeth Bathory,
Okay.
also known as the Blood Countess. And if nothing else, she has gone down in history as one of the world's most prolific serial killers.
Okay. But as the Blood Countess, and you pour salt all over your shoulder, she still has to count it, and that's why she gets the Countess.
Oh, you and your puns.
What? I just like making jokes.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, we're going to get back into why she's really the Blood Countess. Now, more so than the number of girls that she killed, it's how she did it that really gives people pause.
Girls? Seriously?
Now, I do talk about Elizabeth a little bit in the Bloody Mary episode of Campfire Compendium, so I won't go too deep here. The main thing I want you to know is that the stories say she was so concerned about getting old and losing her beauty that she would hire young girls to be servants to live in her castle. She would then kill them and bathe in their blood. It's quite possible that these stories were exaggerated to make her seem worse than she really was.
Yeah.
For example, the historical research calls the bloodbaths into question, but it was enough to ruin her reputation, and she wound up spending the rest of her life alone, imprisoned in a dark, windowless room.
It's almost like taking a bath with tomato sauce, because if you get sprayed by a skunk, you have to do that.
Yeah, but blood is really sticky.
Blood is sticky, tomatoes aren't. They're most likely slimy and slidey. Ugh.
So I do have another question for you.
What is it?
Why do you think people believe in vampires?
I think because, well, I don't necessarily know, but some people, I think sometimes they think that maybe because of the vampire bat.
That's fair.
Because they're called vampire bats and they drink cow blood.
Sure, but I could see where one might, if a person falls asleep in the wrong spot, vampire bat getting a hold of them. Well, what if I told you, though, there's probably a historical reason for it, too?
More history.
Oh, yeah, history's a part of everything. So if you look to science and history, we have some ideas about what led to vampire panics in the past.
So have they found out, or is it going to be like Nessie again?
This seems a pretty solid guess. You see, when people die, their skin begins to dry out and shrivel up.
Yeah.
Same thing happens with fruit when it's gotten rotten and stuff, right? Like you've seen, think of raisins. They're grapes, right?
Yeah, except...
And then they're all shriveled up and small.
Well, that doesn't mean they're getting old. It just means, like...
But they're dried out.
Yes.
So the same thing happens to your skin. It gets all dry and shrivelly. And so that happens to your gums as well.
Ew, okay.
So your gums dry out and they get smaller. And so the smaller they get, the more your teeth start to show. So it looks kind of like your teeth are growing.
Really?
Yep. And the same thing happens to your fingernails and your hair.
Okay.
So people at the time were very superstitious. And it was easy to see how they would suspect something otherworldly if they happened to dig up a grave and found a corpse with all these changes. In modern times, vampires haven't lost a step in terms of cultural relevance. They may look a little different, and their powers have changed over the years, but they're still very much on people's minds. In fact, there are a number of people out there who claim to be vampires. Now, these folks are still very much alive, and you won't necessarily scare them off with garlic. But some do drink blood. And before you start to worry, they tend to have very strict rules about how they go about obtaining their blood. It needs to be voluntary, and outside what they believe is a physical need to consume blood, they're pretty much normal people. So as far as you know, you've possibly met a vampire.
Okay.
Just okay? That you're down with that?
I gave you a solid look.
A solid look. Okay. Well, this is a radio show, and people can't see your solid looks. Nor can they hear them. Just saying.
Okay, that's fine with me.
All right. Now it's time for the truly important question of the episode. Who wins in a fight? Werewolves or vampires? Two enter, one leaves. Who wins? Werewolf or vampire?
I think the vampire, because vampires can turn into bats and fly. Most likely werewolves can only jump.
I'm going to hard disagree with you there. I am firmly in camp werewolf, and I believe that a werewolf would absolutely wreck a vampire.
Well, if they got a good grip on them.
Oh, most definitely. And sure, the vampire is going to be fast and sneaky, but the werewolf has, superhuman senses and can hear well and smell. And I don't think that the vampire is going to be able to get the drop on a werewolf.
What if the werewolf had a stake?
Even more of a problem for the vampire.
Yeah, because the werewolf could easily go stake to the head and throw you away.
So the vampire might be able to turn into a bat and try to fly away, but I think the werewolf is just too much. Unless you've got some other supporting evidence here, I'm going to go team werewolf.
I'm staying team vampire because I still think that they can run away fast, and they can also turn into a bat when they run away.
And I think we're at that point in the episode where we're ready to wrap things up. Yep. You got anything else you want to end with, Elias?
I do. I would like to give a shout out to Amelia. My dad says she listens all the time, and I just wanted to say thanks.
Oh, all right. That sounds good. And I'd also like to make a note that Elias and I will be wandering around at CryptidCon in Lexington on September 7th. So if anyone else happens to be there and they see us wandering around, feel free to say hi. And last but not least, also a big thank you to the No Sleep podcast for the shout out in episode 6 of the current season, which is season 13.
Yes.
So everybody feel free to check that out as well.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, I'm Shawn.
I'm Elias.
Until next time.